So, thanks, David. Actually, David gave some introduction, made it less necessary for me to go over some of the introduction I prepared, so that's good. I'm going to talk about work that has to do with curriculum learning. It was done in collaboration with two of my students, Gad Cohen, who left, and Guy Cohen, who is here. And if anybody is interested in talking to him about it, I'm sure he'll be delighted. So when we try to challenge with the problem of buying a puzzle, the first puzzle to a cousin, we're almost certainly not going to, I have to figure out to use two different devices. So we're almost certainly not going to buy this kind of puzzle. It's too complicated. Maybe we'll start with this puzzle, and then continuing with the increasing level of difficulty, we might buy this puzzle, present to our child, and then we'll sit with her and do this puzzle and this puzzle. And finally, maybe the kid is ready for this difficult puzzle. So this is very natural. This is how we think about teaching a child cognitive tasks such as puzzle making. But actually, if you're going to introduce children to, it is a little, can you still hear me? Okay. If we introduce children to categories of objects and visual objects, we are almost certainly also not going to start with a picture like this. If you want to introduce to chairs, maybe this will be the first chair we'll show a child, and then this one, and so on. And this maybe slightly less intuitive intuition was actually studied by psychologists, and they have showed that if you ask a person to teach children a visual concept, they will also introduce objects at an increasing level of difficulty. And actually, it seems like we have a very clear notion of representative images of objects and less representative. So, and we'll start with those that are more representative and gradually introduce the more unusual objects. And that's actually, it sounds very intuitive, and maybe you're surprised why I'm bothering talking about it for 2 minutes, but it's actually very different from the way it's done in machine learning. So machine learning, the theory, the practice, is based on random sampling of data. We have, if we introduce if we want to try a neural network, certain visual objects, there is a set of objects. A teacher would choose them randomly, and this is the way it's done. It's also the way it's required if we want to use most of the guarantees that we have that the system will actually learn and work. So we actually usually expect that the data, the training data and the test data will be sampled in the same way from the same distribution. And that's the typical way. There are exceptions, and people might recognize in the audience strategies like boosting, active learning. We've seen a little bit in David's talk. Well, the system is actually exploring. So you typically would ask a teacher to label for you an example that's difficult for you. There is a methodology that's called hard data mining. These things, what they have in common is actually they put emphasis on the more difficult examples. So you learn a certain concept, you figure out what's difficult for you, and you ask for help in that sense. So you put more emphasis on that. None of these methods does what the curriculum that I just tried to explain to you intuitively, what it does. A curriculum actually starts with the more easier example and put a lot of emphasis on learning the easier examples first, and only then focus on the more difficult one. So we don't see it in machine learning, and that's the subject that was one reason why we got interested in this subject. People learn this way, machines don't learn this way. Why is that? So just to simplify things, curriculum is a lot of things to a lot of different people. If we go to Mount Corpus, it will be a very complicated concept. For us, it's a very simple, very isolated, simple idea of curriculum. What I mean by curriculum is that we sort the examples by difficulty, and we introduce to the learner, machine, human, whatever, the examples based on increasing level of difficulty, just like a teacher might do at the very early stages of learning. So this is not a very well-studied area in machine learning. There have been some work, but most of them have been empirical studies. And what people have shown that this strategy helps. If you're able to give a learner an examples in an increasing level of difficulty, it will improve his learning or make it possible for him or her to learn something that he's not been able to learn before. And this is something that I'll come back to at the end in the context of perceptual learning. So the general empirical result is that curriculum learning speeds up learning and improves the outcome. And it's very intuitive results. There's very little theory about it, so we don't really understand why it helps. And actually, there is another question, which is, if it helps, well, why don't you use it more often? Why do we hardly see it? If you go to a machine learning conference, you will hardly see it actually being used in practice. And the answer is very simple. Well, you don't use it because it requires additional tutoring from the teacher. It requires a teacher that will tell you, sort the examples for you, and being able to give you the easier example first. And that's actually a complicated issue. And one of the questions that we've studied in this study is how to do that without a teacher. So how can we get a curriculum if there is no human learner, annotator that can give it to us? So just a little bit about the work, previous work in this area in machine learning. So of course, there is a lot of work in human learning. So people have been interested in it. There is a few papers here from the recent times. The reason I put it up, this particular selection, other than Belgio's paper, that's kind of a seminal paper because they really brought the question to the surface and discussed it, even though their examples are very simple. But the other three papers represent how it's being used. So it's being used when you have a very clear notion of difficulty. For example, you're trying to annotate programs, and then the nesting level of the program can actually be associated or connected to difficulty. So you start with less nesting and increase the nesting, and this is how you generate automatically a curriculum. Or you can evaluate text or utterances and rank them by the length of the utterance. Shorter utterances are easier. If you're trying to learn more complicated things, you actually would need a human annotator. For example, if you're trying to learn categorization, and in this paper, it's very hard to automatically obtain that. So what I'm going to do in the remaining 40 minutes of my talk is describe to you an empirical study where we demonstrate that with deep learning, the technology that's currently working very effective in visual object recognition, we can obtain the same empirical results we've seen in other tasks. So curriculum improves the rate of learning and brings about better outcomes. So that's fine. The big challenge here was trying to understand why it happens. How can you explain it? And I'll describe two somewhat different theoretical viewpoints that we try to take. And the first one is a very thorough analysis of two simple problems. So that's one way to approach it. One is linear regression. The other is hinge loss minimization. And I'll show you very, very concrete results, theorems. This is how it should happen. But this is not deep learning. It can give us insights what might happen maybe in the basic of attraction. The second one, we're trying to analyze the problem in a more general way, and I'll describe to you, if you like, a Bayesian view of curriculum learning and how curriculum learning affect the optimization landscape of the problem. And actually, we see some surprising things here. So this analysis, I'm not sure, clarifies why curriculum learning should help. I'll leave it as an open question. Finally, in the last part of the talk, I'll get to the connection of this stuff or investigation of curriculum learning in the context of perceptual learning, and I'll go back to some of the questions actually that David raised in his talk. So David talked about convolution neural networks so very briefly. I will also talk about it very briefly. But this is one of the successes of actually the neuroscience, one of the maybe the major contribution of neuroscience to deep learning is the intuition that led to the evolution of convolution neural networks in the context of that are particularly effective in the context of computer vision and the dealing with images. So convolution neural networks has these four, if you like, characteristics or some more that distinguish it from regular networks or fully connected networks that are unstructured. It has local connectivity. There are shared weights. The concept of multiple feature maps. These are the convolutions, the maps of convolutions. And there is an operation that people call pooling and ReLU. It's not, I think what's really interesting here is these ideas are borrowed from neuroscience almost literally. So the local convolution, or the idea of using convolution is very closely related to the idea of receptive fields, which are the cornerstone of the visual architecture. Shared weights are reminiscent of feature maps. We have multiple feature maps in each level, and these, to me at least, reminiscence of the cortical column. And then we need the nonlinear operators. That's actually something that have been studied a lot in neuroscience. We need them too. Winner take all, nonlinear filters, various nonlinear operators that operate in the neural level. In CNNs, these are the pooling and ReLUs and additional operators. So Jan LeCun worked on this architecture for like 10 years, from the 80s to the 90s, without making much impact on the outside community, but he had these networks that got better and better, and at the end they could do excellent results on images of digits. And that's where it stays for a very long time. And then what came about is that we were able to implement networks that are just much bigger. So this is, for example, a picture of the network that we have been using in our study, and every little square here is like a square here, so you see there is just a lot more of them. So that's one thing that happened, and the other thing that happened in the revolution that made it possible, and that made those architectures so effective in computer vision, is the data, the source of data. All of a sudden, we got a lot of training data, and that was something that was accumulating, and with very big architecture and a lot of training data, we got qualitative differences, and we saw that this architecture surpassed every other competitor, and now these are the best algorithm, if you like, that in computer vision. So computer vision has been totally changed by the emergence of this architecture and the power that it got. I'm hearing my own echoes, okay? Sorry. Okay, so this is the architecture we are using. That's the end of this introductory part. And what's a curriculum algorithm, curriculum learning? Like I said, in machine learning, what we do is we sample data randomly. It's like this picture that I showed you. You put your hand into a urn and you sample the data, and you do it repeatedly. In curriculum learning, there is one difference. So we have to have a scoring function that will score the data and tell us and rank it by difficulty. And then what we'll do, we have another thing that we separate this process for two. The other part of the process is pacing function that it tells us how we are going to limit the sampling. So in this particular example, in our algorithm, what we do is that we only allow at each point, we only sample examples from the most, say 10% most easiest examples. And this percentage increases. So that's what the pacing function allows us. It allows us to sample examples only from a certain level of difficulty, at which point we continue the way we did before, which is randomly sampling data. We call it mini batches. We're sampling these mini batches and then introduce them to the system. Okay? So I'm not going to go into any more detail. I imagine that you can still ask me. I'll continue with David's policy, then you can stop me with questions. But without getting into any more details, We compare this training strategy to the regular strategy, and these are the first results that I'm going to show you. So vanilla is the regular method. We have a certain network, a CNN network. We're training it by random sampling of the data. We get results that we call vanilla. It's in gray here. And then we use, in comparison, we use the curriculum learning that I just described, and I'll show it in blue in the rest of the presentation. So you can see improvement, and you can see that the improvement is significant. We worried at the beginning that this might be, there's lots of things we change. When we do curriculum, first of all, we introduced an order. We all of a sudden sample examples from mini batches that are increasing in size. So we want to make sure that this is not what's making the benefit. And also we try to look what happens in the if we actually prefer more difficult example. And remember, this was one of the puzzles that I started with. If we see other heuristics in machine learning, those heuristics actually prefer more difficult example. So what happens if we give the network, it will let us see the more difficult examples first and then the easier one. That's what we call anti-curriculum here, and that's the results here. So the two controls are worse. This is the vanilla, and the curriculum, the intuitive curriculum actually helps. This is the learning curve, I will not show it most of the time, but for the first time we want to see it. This is how the improvement is, how the performance is improving over time. And we can see the 4 different strategies that we're using. So you can see that curriculum, interestingly, start off better. It improves much faster than all the other methods. And at the end, it gets to a better point. So that's the typical performance that we see again and again and again. It's very robust. If we introduce curriculum, it does better than vanilla. It does better than the other controls, starts better, and stays better. We tried a few more things, a few more database, a few more architectures to make sure that we are not seeing something that's anecdotal. So these are benchmark data sets. Some of you might be familiar with them. If Yair was in the audience, he would know because he's one of the people on the original authors on the paper that introduced this database. This is a very convenient database to use because the pictures are small, so you can repeat the experiments many times. And we can see that curriculum, now we only see curriculum vanilla, it always improves with the benchmark data set, small network, cats, a subset of examples from the ImageNet that David talked about. So this is, these are bigger images. And if we take a competitive network that people that's available for everybody to use on the internet, it's called VGG. It's one of the, used to be one of the state-of-the-art networks. Then it also benefits from the use of curriculum. So curriculum helps, it's very useful. This is an interesting results. What we see here, so here the colors are slightly different. Green is curriculum, blue is not curriculum. We see the same effect. It starts better, stays better, but the important thing is that we see 3 different tasks that are related, only that this is harder. This is clearly easier. You see the performance at 80%. This is less, this is more difficult, and this is the most difficult. And opposite to the difficulty, you can see that the relative improvement is the highest in the most difficult task. And this is, again, something we see with curriculum again and again. It helps when the task is difficult. It helps less if the task is easy. And that's another thing that might explain why we don't see it in machine learning, because people are actually keep working on problems that they know how to solve. Okay, that's an excellent question. I'm getting to it. So that's really one of the key questions of this whole thing. And I'll get to it in the next slide. So before I get to it, one more result. What I didn't tell you is that the source of the curriculum. So we obtained this curriculum by training another network, asking her to perform the task. This was a powerful network. It ranked the examples for us. And then when we use this ranking, we were able to get benefit. What if we don't have access to a more powerful network, or what we are using a very competitive data that just appeared, and we're using the best network there is to address it? So this is the second heuristics we use to approach this problem. We actually take the same network that we are training now, train it to the end, rank the examples based on how well how confident the network was in terms of classification, so the activation of the neurons, if you like. So we rank the examples based on this measure and use this to retrain the network from scratch. And we get roughly the same performance. Guys here, you can talk to him. He did these experiments, and it's not exactly the same, even though it looks like this. Slightly less stable, as bootstrapping is always less stable. But still, we get similar results. So we still get the same phenomenon. If somebody gives us the ranking of the examples, either another network which is stronger, or ourselves, having trained ourselves and then forget, forcing ourselves to forget, which is certainly not a biological strategy. If we are able to, if we have access to a curriculum, we get improvement, and it's significant. So, yeah, so that's an assumption. I am going to talk about difficulty. I'm not talking about this. I'm not going to talk about this assumption. This is the more cognitive assumption that if we learn the simpler concept, they help us abstract more difficult one. And I'll get to it a little bit when I talk about perceptual learning, where the concepts are very simple. So you can actually talk about abstraction of concept. Here, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to, but I am going to talk about difficulty. So what makes something more difficult and why that should help. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some theoretical analysis where I think the main contribution is, first of all, the definition of difficulty, and then the results that we actually prove in a very simple framework, in a convex framework, which is limited, of course, because it has a single global minima. But in this framework, and not every convex framework, but in two particular loss functions, which are common, linear regression and hinge loss minimization, which is the base foundation of support vector machines. In this framework, we can actually prove that a curriculum should get us faster convergence to the global minimum, okay? And I'll start with the definition of difficulty. So, I'll start with the theorems and then I'll get to the difficulty. So first, since I don't have much time, I'm going to just introduce the theorems and tell you a few words about how we prove them. The first one tells us that the convergence rate of the algorithm is monotonically decreasing with the difficulty score. Okay, so if we introduce easier points, then the network will converge faster. And that's what we've seen in those plots that I've shown you. The training with curriculum starts faster. The increase in performance is faster. The second one is, notice it's kind of opposite, but the convergence rate is increasing with the loss with respect to the current hypothesis. And this is what people usually do. How do I know that an example is difficult? I look at it. I'm doing active learning now. I'm looking at something. I can't classify it, and then I'm going to the teacher and ask him to classify it for me. And so that effectively what it means is that with the current hypothesis, or with myself, I'm now, after having trained myself on a few examples, I look at this example, I judge how difficult it is, and if it's very difficult, I ask for a labeling. Boosting does something similar. So this is actually the right thing to do, because if the points that are more difficult for me at the time, I can actually prove that the convergence rate is increasing with the loss. So if I use examples that are more difficult, I will actually converge faster. So there are two things that are opposite here, and I'm going to explain them in a minute. Okay, so the definition. We'll start with the empirical risk minimization formalism, which is the common one used in machine learning, empirical machine learning. So what we're trying to optimize usually is the expected loss of the data that we have. We need a certain loss function that tells us how much we lose by for a certain prediction and or for a certain error, and X is our data, age is our hypothesis. And what we're doing is we take the expected value of this function over all the data. So we need to define two things, which we have this hypothesis here, and we have two hypotheses that are special for us. One is the optimal hypothesis, which I denoted here by H bar. This is the one we are trying to learn. And remember, now I'm analyzing convex problem. There is a single one of them. This is the optimal hypothesis in the optimization landscape. And in addition, there is the hypothesis that I'm holding at the moment. I've learned for a while, and I've reached a certain model, and I call it HT, at time t. These are different. What we would like a learning algorithm to do is to, we like HT to converge to this one. That would guarantee that we actually learn the right thing. So we have two different loss functions, and we can measure the. I attach different symbols to the different value, the loss with respect of a certain. So we have a point, a function, and the loss of our point with respect to the optimal function I call psi. The loss of our point with respect to the current hypothesis I call epsilon. And this is what I would call difficulty. So the loss of the point with respect to the optimum, the one that the hypothesis that we are trying to learn, this is the difficulty. If the point which is difficult would have a high loss with respect to the optimal value. It's difficult to the best learner that we are trying to learn. This epsilon is the difficulty with respect to the current hypothesis. This is what boosting is using. This is what active learning are using. We're looking at the moment at HT. We're seeing how much we lose, how difficult it is for us to predict it. And if we lose a lot, it's very hard to predict. We call it difficult. If it's not, we call it easy. Okay? G would be any monotonic function. It's just that in our calculation, it doesn't really matter as long as it's monotonic. So we have these two measures, and what we're doing in our theory is actually we're computing this value, which is the expected length of the gradient step at each point of time with respect to these two quantities, and we show that we compute it and we can differentiate it, and we actually show that if we take this value, which we want to be as big as possible, tells us how fast we are getting to our target. We want it to get as fast as possible to our target. If we differentiate this point with respect to the global difficulty, it's negative. That means that the more difficult the point is, the slower the convergence rate is. If we look at the difficulty, at the local difficulty, we get exactly the opposite. So the more difficult the point is at the moment, the faster we converge. Okay? And these are really detailed, very technical details, so of course you can't understand. I haven't presented the results, I haven't presented the proof, but I just want to show you the methodology, which is that if you take the assumptions of the model, these results are very strong, very robust. These are just something, these are mathematical theorems that hold for every quantity that you have. So, delta, this? Delta? Delta is the expected length of each gradient step in the correct direction. We take the step that we are taking in gradient descent, we project it on the correct direction, and we measure its length, and we want it to be as big as possible, because that tells us how close we get to the optimal hypothesis. Okay, but that's about all I wanted to say about this theoretical part. I'm going back to the empirical data. So this, I analyzed certain mathematical problems. They are convex, so they only describe maybe what happened in the basic of attraction of deep learning. But interestingly enough, here, when we go back to our simulation that I showed you at the beginning, and we look at what happens, now we plot here the distance between the gradient step that the neural network is taking. So each step that the neural is taking, its angular difference from the ideal step, the step we would have liked it to take towards the optimal hypothesis. And we see that with hard example, this difference is much larger, just like our analysis was telling us. So at the beginning, the distance of the difficult examples from the optimal direction is large, about 70 degrees, which is quite a bit, and the easier examples are much closer, they're pointing in the right direction, and that might explain why we see faster convergence and a better outcome. This benefit of the hard examples is actually reduced. After 10 epochs, it's smaller, and after 20 epochs, it's also not significant. So this is something that happened at the beginning of training, and it's also going to be important point that I'm going to raise. One last point that I'm going to discuss in this context, there is another heuristic that I didn't mention before that's also employing a dynamic strategy of sampling. So what we're doing here is about sampling the data in a dynamic way. Instead of doing what machine learning typically does, which is random sampling, we're introducing a certain dynamic sampling. A curriculum introduces the idea of sampling easier examples. And I told you that there are other heuristics that are introducing the heuristics of sampling more difficult examples. And the theoretical part tells us how they can coexist. If you sample easier example with respect to the final hypothesis you're trying to learn, this is the right thing. If you're looking at your current hypothesis, then you should sample more difficult example. And there is this thing that's called self-paced learning that was introduced by Daphna and her colleagues 7 years ago. And what they did is they actually sampled easier examples based on your current hypothesis. So they also said, okay, let's look at the examples we have. Let's look at the hypotheses we currently have, rank them by difficulty, and prefer the easier examples. It's called self-paced learning. And if you remember the two theorems that I just presented, this actually should be the wrong thing to do, because if you order point with respect to the goal that you're trying to reach, then you should prefer the more difficult one. Okay, so our prediction would be that this strategy heuristic will perform less well, and this is what we see. So far, everything is nice, everything is consistent, and the theory that we have, the definitions that we have are able to explain to us the different heuristics that people have been using and why they might be successful under different conditions. Just to summary all the conditions that we've done in the empirical study. So this is the vanilla curriculum, just ranking examples based on an oracle or the inception network, the Google inception network gives us improvement. If we order the examples based on our self-study, we also get the same performance. Two other variations on our curriculum algorithm gave us roughly the same improvement. And the control condition, including the self-paced learning, did not get improvement, actually got deterioration. So far, so good, very a close story. But the theoretical analysis that I described to you was involved a very simple model, convex, two convex functions. Neural network deep learning, which is where I started with, are not convex, and definitely not convex, and that's most of their power lies. So the second thing we tried to do in a theoretical aspect was to try to see or analyze what effect the curriculum learning might have on the energy landscape of our optimization problem in general. So again, a few definitions. If you like, empirical risk optimization is all about optimizing the expected value of the loss. In curriculum learning, we can view it as a Bayesian variation on empirical risk optimization. So instead of just averaging the loss of the points, we attach a prior to each point. And U here is different than the loss. It can be a certain monotonic function of the loss. Ignore this. It's just slightly more general. Let's ignore this point for the moment. What's important here is that we replace the 1 over n by p of xi. So instead of giving all the points the same weight, we are giving each point a different weight based on its difficulty. And in particular, ideal curriculum, what we do in a curriculum will give a higher weight to points that are easier with respect to the ultimate hypothesis. So if we try to see what it does, this is the picture we get, which is actually somewhat surprising. I think it should be more surprising to the physicists in the crowd. We see that before curriculum, the energy landscape of this particular function was black here. After curriculum, it's the red function. So what happens, what we see, what curriculum does, it's actually, it makes the function more, if you like, it stretches it. It makes the difference between the minima and the maxima larger. And as a result, it makes the gradients bigger. So this is fine. We can understand why this would help. But actually, it should help at the end, not at the beginning, because at the beginning, when you have an energy landscape like this, it's actually more difficult to escape local minima, and you can see that it's on the oppositely or conversely, it's easier to get stuck in local minima and more difficult to get out of them. So why this help? We don't know. But what we can know that the ideal curriculum, what the analysis tells us is the ideal curriculum, and every curriculum, if you like, curriculum scheduling, that's positively correlated with the ideal curriculum, or positively correlated with a function that's monotonically decreasing with difficulty, would give us the same performance. So this is what the curriculum is doing to the energy landscape. A higher probability is it's a Bayesian assumption. Higher probability means I'm more likely to sample it. The regular one is 1 over n, right? I give all my examples. Yeah. And essentially what I'm saying, what curriculum does, it changes the distribution of the examples. It gives higher probability to examples that are whatever I want. The way we defined it, easier with respect to the ultimate hypothesis. So just to summarize what we learned from this theoretical analysis, I told you at the beginning that we have a fairly nice pictures, but these are the things that the theoretical analysis is not explaining for us. So what we see in our empirical finding, the curriculum learning steers optimization to better local minimum. And we don't have explanation for that in the theory. The convex theory, there is a single optimum, so it can tell us about moving away from local minima. And in the Bayesian analysis, what we saw is that the curriculum is giving us a steeper function, and it's not clear why that would help us steer away from local minima, unless you believe that the optimization function looks totally different, which may come up in Tommy's talk. The other thing is that we get empirical results show that curriculum helps mostly at the beginning. You have to have a curriculum helps you bootstrap yourself, if you like. And we've seen it in the part, in the different pacing function that I've shown there. Our curriculum, our theoretical results tells us actually that it should always help. And in particular, when we are getting to the basing of attraction of the network, where it behaves like a convex function, curriculum should help. We should see improvement, and we don't see that. Sorry? So this is the energy landscape, which is after which effectively I'm sample points equally with 1 over n. I translated the distribution to an effect on the an energy landscape. Now for these two functions, I sample the examples exactly the same way. Okay? So. Okay, so why am I talking in this, why am I talking a perceptual learning session? Because all this does have a connection. It's actually, this work started with perceptual learning. Perceptual learning is a very interesting aspect of human learning, and the nice thing about it is that it's relatively simple. We learn simple concepts, and therefore we can analyze them and understand, and maybe get better intuition to questions that came up before here, what is difficult and what is easy and other things. So it's a very interesting domain. You can learn a lot about human learning. And our interest in this concept, in this problem, focused around two computational problems. One is generalization versus specificity, which is not something that came up here today. And the other, learning with curriculum versus learning. So in perceptual learning, we have the same phenomena. And this is actually a paper, let me skip to that. And this is a paper, this was shown, maybe not for the first time, but one of the first papers showing it by Shaul and Merav, here about 20 years ago. And in a task like that, in a discrimination perceptual learning task, where your task is, what you're trying to do is discriminate a line whose orientation is different from the background of lines. In this task, if you make it very difficult, for example, the difference between the orientations is small, it actually helps if you introduce to people with easier example first. So they came up with this setup where there is a task which is very difficult, people cannot learn it, but if you first introduce to them an easier version of the same task, for example, you increase the orientation, this is not what they did, but just for illustration, if you introduce an easier version of the same task and then teach people, they can learn. So we see the same thing in curriculum learning, in perceptual learning. In this work, what we're trying to do, and I'm going to skip it because I don't have time, what we're trying to do was simulate a bunch of results. I'll tell you that we succeeded in doing it. But what we're trying to do, what's more interesting for the purpose of this talk, is to see what happens in the neural network that we are simulating, or presumably what happened in the neural substrate that can explain what happens here. And this is the slide that might be showing it, and this is the slide one before last. The next one is the conclusion. So these are the weights of our network. They're spread over a line. This is a multi-layer network. We put them all on a line. And what we are plotting here is the activation of each neuron, if you like. In yellow, you have the activation after we finish the first part of the training where we trained with easy examples. And then in blue, we saw the activation of the same neuron at the end of the training when we introduced the more difficult examples. And what you see, and it's not obvious, is that the blue is always higher than the yellow. So what it means, it could have changed direction, it could have done a lot of things. But if we zoom in to a small part of the network, what we see that if a certain neuron had a positive weight, what will happen to it, it will become more positive. If it had a negative weight, it will become more negative. It will never change direction, not in this simulation. So what happens here, what curriculum did in this particular simulation, this particular perceptual learning task, is that if you like, the parameter shape was, the size of the hypothesis space, or the parameter space, was significantly reduced. You're not searching over all parameter values. You're just searching over parameter values which are a positive multiplication of what you had before. If you had positive, it would be more positive, negative, more positive. And that might explain why learning is becoming faster, increase. Sorry? We did this particular experiment. This is a set of a few experiments. We did it with a few tasks, 2 perceptual learning tasks. And this particular we saw the same effect on the different networks. This one, I think this was actually on the task that I've shown you with the discrimination of a certain direction. One where you have 2 directions and you have you're discriminating and you change the location. It's a little complicated, but we can talk about it later, about the detail of the experiment. So it's not, we shouldn't take it as representative to what always happens, but here is one example of what happened, and at least in this example, we can understand why learning was faster, and which is what we've seen. And this is what was shown in humans. So to summarize, we've studied the curriculum learning. The problem is motivated by human learning. We see curriculum in human learning, in perceptual learning, in human cognitive learning. We see it everywhere. This is how people teach other people. Of course, people can learn without, children learn also by themselves. They learn in an unsupervised way. But curriculum is a very important strategy. And in this work, what we did is first we introduced, I think, the first theoretical analysis that can explain at least some of what we see in curriculum learning, why it helps or in what way it helps. I've shown you an empirical study in the context of deep learning where we show that it actually helps deep network. I think maybe one of the more interesting results is this discrepancy in the literature. We see conflicting in the machine learning literatures. We see conflicting strategies of methods that are using dynamic sampling of data. Some prefer easier examples, some difficult examples, and I try to explain how we can put them all together and they can all coexist nicely and peacefully together. And finally, a part that's probably important is one reason why curriculum learning is not used is that it requires additional labeling. And to this end, we actually introduced two ideas, a transfer from a strong, deep, powerful network, or ranking of the data based on training the same network, and we showed that that can also help. So hopefully, curriculum learning can actually be used in practice. Thank you.